growing trees, developing as a teacher, what does that have to do with, what was it, communication, emotion, and reflection? Well, I'd like to continue the personal journey that Tom was talking about from the point of view of focusing on teachers. I think it's very telling that apart from the really sort of inspiring start that Bob gave us yesterday about big questions of why learn, and Chia's incredibly energizing how to teach culture differently, that both Sarah and Tom focus very much on teachers for once, not just on learners and learning. And I think it's a sign of the times, and it's high time, I think, that this is happening. So my own take on growing trees and developing teachers has to do with the fact that I love trees. And I love teaching. I also love teachers. But because I see a lot of commonalities in the way that trees grow, and ideally teachers grow. Tom's just said you can't develop anyone, you can't develop a teacher, you can't make a tree grow either. You can do something for the tree to thrive, but there are also circumstances where trees don't grow. Okay? And I'd like to take you on that journey and sort of indulge me a little bit by making it a rather personal one, from the point of view of where does teacher development actually start, and what are some of the stops along the journey? How much can we generalize, and how much of it is really in the ways that trees grow very organic and not very predictable? So we've got a big tree here and a small tree, and I'd like to start with this person. So that's me at age 6. And I did not want to become a teacher then. Okay? I wanted to become something like Jacques Cousteau. Maybe some of you still remember. You know, dive with sharks and be in the sea. I love water as well, and get paid for it. I thought that was, really cool. So, given that we're in well-being mode now, can I invite you to do the following? I would like you to, yes, talk to the person next to you. Do you still remember when you were at that age? Did you want to become teachers? Or what was it that actually you felt at the time you wanted to do for a living? I teach English, and I train teachers in Budapest. And so the question of how teachers develop has been with me as part of how I see my role as a teacher trainer. And it seems I still don't know, actually. In the very way that people really don't quite know, I'll come back to that later, how trees grow exactly. Now, let me just give you a quick overview of the sorts of things I would like to talk about. And maybe as you read, you might sort of anticipate or think, wonder what this heading is about. So I will talk a little bit, I will have to give a definition of sorts, and I will also talk a little bit about or mention some models of teacher development, but I've always felt that even though they're useful analytically, they seem to not tell the whole story. And some of them, I feel, tell a story that doesn't resonate with my experience. This, however, I think is a good definition, just for a moment. And I like it because there's growth in there, so you can already see there, I like that. You've got the parallel with trees. But it also points to the fact that if growth is involved in development, it's actually a very organic process. So it doesn't just happen intellectually. You learn more in terms of knowledge and skills, or increased experience, or indeed changes in values, beliefs, and so on. It's quite likely that any one of these three will influence the others. It's not just that you go through one bit of change, a bit of development, and that's it. So that's something, this being organic, I'm very interested in. Just very briefly, a couple of models that you will find if you kind of look after teacher development. I think everybody would agree experience is key in order to gain expertise as a teacher. I think it's also true that experience itself is not enough. I think we can all remember teachers who, after, I don't know, 25 years, seem to have fossilized into 1 year of teaching. If it's not reflected, or the wisdom of reflected experience, then that is not enough to develop, I don't think. There are many models that show you the development of teachers from beginner or novice to competent to expert and so on. Again, that's useful sometimes to think, but I have a problem with staging. I have a problem with sequences where you kind of go linearly, and certainly in terms of development. I think it's much more cyclical. Huberman, I think, goes further in this, looking at life cycles and maybe also domain-specific development. So that's, I think, a model that I have found useful. And there's Wenger's community of practice. Again, very useful. I just have a problem with peripheral. Because the idea is, you know, as a young teacher, as a trainee, you move into the core of experienced practitioners from the periphery. I think my trainees wouldn't like the idea of being peripheral somehow. And I think there's something missed if you overlook the fact that they too are capable of incredible learning much, much earlier than an expert teacher or an experienced teacher. So for all these reasons, I'd like to sort of cast the net a little wider and in particular go back to this guy for a moment, because the reason why I chose it is also to do with this smile. I was told much later that I was a smiley kid, and the way I relate to others was sort of telling in terms of the smile that I had. And I think Kotopovin said that a smile actually creates reality. So it's not just that, you know, smiley, but when you smile, it's you get a mirror back. It is actually something about human connection. Now, the reason why I'm saying is that a couple of years ago, I had a strange experience that led me to think about and look after what's called signature strengths of people. And I'll say a little bit more about it, but it has to do with who we are, some qualities that we have, some characteristics of ours, and how they actually match the work we do, or don't match the work we do. So let me go back to this strange experience. I had somebody come to my classes, shadow my classes for a while, and then this is in the article that she wrote when I had to read the manuscripts. That's what she wrote. Well, I thought that was a mixed blessing. I mean, I was seriously hoping for something, and they mentioned the fact how much they'd learned about, you know, intercultural communication in this case, and, you know, they came out the wiser. There was nothing about that at all. And I thought, maybe it's a one-off. So I started trawling through feedback, which is now, like in many cases, online over the past few years. And it was the same thing. So, interesting. So this is not about blowing my own trumpet, but there's something there that I had underrated in the way that I teach, and that I didn't think. It's like, who was it yesterday? The fish, I think, cheer, fish in water. You know, that was, of course, I mean, that's what one does. But it got noted so much so that the actual takeaway seemed to be secondary to what the students felt. So then I was delighted to find, actually, this is a signature strength. Martin Seligman and colleagues came up with 24, looking at the match between the qualities that we have, character strengths, and how well they match the work we do. So kindness is one of them. And under the big categories you can see creativity, curiosity, judgment, love of learning, perspective, bravery, perseverance, honesty, I like that, zest, love, there's kindness, social intelligence, teamwork, fairness, leadership, and so on. So then I started thinking, maybe I need to look more at the water I'm so used to. And are there other things in my teaching and my training that I had overlooked, but that probably make a difference to the students that I work with? And then I realized a couple of things. I've been playing table tennis even longer than I've been teaching. And I've always loved table tennis because you really have to, learn on the hoof. You have to be very quick in responding to the situation. But it's also been instrumental in the fact that I started coaching little ones. And even though I didn't want to become a teacher, I then realized, wow, this is actually cool. They learn something from me. I sing, and I play the guitar. I still do. And then I realized whenever I teach English, I pay a lot of attention to giving students a voice. And by that I mean getting them into what I would call the music of English, the particular rhythm that comes from stress timing. Not so much teaching pronunciation, ship and sheep-wise, but very much with suprasegmental features. It's always been key to my teaching, a regular feature. I like being someone else on occasion. So a bit of drama, I find that easy. And then when I thought about, particularly my training, to kind of model a particular student or difficulty, I really enjoy being someone else, dramatizing what I do. And finally, I'm a visualizer. When I was a kid, particularly a young kid, I was doodling a lot. Well, my daughter said, that's probably ADHD. But I think it's more than that. I think it's a way of thinking, helping me think and learning over time how visualizing actually helps students. Way more than I would have thought. But it's second nature to me now. And you can see some of the images that, just little things as I talk, as I present, as I respond when I elicit what comes from students. So this has really made me think a lot more about the trainees than I have now. Because I was convinced that they are not aware of many of the strengths they have that they didn't think matter in teaching. And I was delighted from time to time that there were some. Before I show you an example, I think that's a very nice way of summarizing this signature strength. So I'm trying to, how do you say that in English? The job served some of my inclinations in a way that I had no idea they did. Yeah, something like that. So the inclinations were there, and they found their way into the way that I teach and the way that I train. Here's an example from Fonny's, one of her classes. It was a rather dense text, and this is what she did with it for her students. Just developing, that's the end, that's the way it looked at the end, but she kind of carefully reconstructed the reading with the help of the board. It's a small thing, but I think it probably made quite a difference to a lot of students in her class. So, back to you. I tried to make that a little bit bigger. Think for a moment. Would you say you have a signature strength that perhaps you hadn't thought of so much that has found its way into the way you teach or work? It could be any one of them around the tree. The question mark stands for any of the things that I've shown you that are non-professional strengths. Okay? Maybe you need a moment just to think. So is there a signature strength that's seen? That's very much me, and it's actually part of the way that I work, the way that I teach. And I would say that, for me, this kind of signature strength really is part of the roots. I think it's well worth going back to these roots. Formative experiences. What I mean by that is I have in mind training or qualification. I think most of us have gone through some sort of training, sometimes very long, sometimes shorter. If you think CELTA, courses. But what I'm interested in is experiences that actually do something to us in a big way. Now, you see me here when I was doing my MEd in the UK with Jamila. And Jamila Mustafa. Yes. And she was from Malaysia. And this is us at the end of a presentation of a project. It was a group project. I was the only man in the group. And it was horrible. Because I had to learn how not to be me in that group. Because, for many reasons, the other group members would not want to contribute. You know, cooperative skills. So it's not about me saying, okay, I know what we're going to do, all right? Let's do this and that. And I started out that way, and they said, oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah, now write it down. Great. Okay. So I learned something like the power of the pen, which is, in a group setting, somebody who actually has the pen and takes notes is more powerful than the rest of people. Yes. They very often also end up talking and explaining. Okay? It wasn't pleasant. I looked pretty exhausted, and I was. So what I'm saying is that in true formative experiences, there is a formative crisis, actually. Something where your confidence that you have, based on what you know and what you can do, is perhaps not shattered, but certainly shaken. And this destabilization has to be accepted. And if you are in a supportive group, if you get feedback, if you are able to act on it as a teacher, you will reconstruct your confidence, and actually also your teacher self, in a way. This is after a number of mentor training courses, so these are people who support trainee teachers in schools. And I remember one of the teachers saying, who was a very good teacher, what did she say? Mirte, she said, I feel like a tribal healer at medical university. And at first I thought, I was, putting names on things that she knew, or questioning what she had done, or just being questioned by her colleagues. That was a destabilization that she had to work through. Needless to say, she became a fantastic mentor later. And she kept her teacher self, so the ability to teach, that was kind of a core, but there were many things around it that did change. Now, that takes me to a conceptualization I found really useful in this context. Adrian Underhill talked about this as two forms of development. The first one is what he calls horizontal development. So it's like a quantitative. You learn, how to give instructions, set up group work, error correction, you name it. You know something about learning, teaching, about learners. He would call that sort of more of the same, in a way. It's very useful and it's very important. But it is also very often part of, or it does not touch things which are much deeper. So, when you, even as a trained teacher, you will still have memories of your old teachers. They're often learning myths, well, don't smile before Christmas, or these things like, only use English in the classroom, that sort of thing. So he says, well, the real deal, or the real complementary side of this, is vertical development. And that happens when you've got a kind of crisis, or at least a formative experience in your training, where some of your beliefs, assumptions, learning myths are shaken, or others come into the foreground and overlay or replace some of those beliefs or assumptions. Okay. So for me, in that example with the master's course, I had quite a number of assumptions shaken about myself, about what learning is. I learned a lot about what a course book is. I realized a large class is not 40 students, but 170 maybe. with my Indian peers. Okay? So there's an enormous amount of learning and reconceptualization. I think there are very few trees that are alone, I mean, when you think about it. And teachers feel alone, but more often than not, they are in some kind of community. Let's just call it that. I really got excited about Peter Wohlleb's book, The Hidden Life of Trees. I don't know if any of you know it. Das geheime Leben der Bäume. Which is fascinating because he just points out how trees communicate through chemicals, through electrical signals with each other, if there's insect threats, if there's drought. Now, I would say, and we've heard already bits of that from Sarah, it does make a huge difference where you are as a teacher and whether you are in a communicating, caring community or not. Particularly when you're faced with challenges that are thrown at us basically all the time. I've been very lucky. I've been in the same department for 30 years. And in fact, it's not just me. We have very, very little fluctuation. And I think it has to do with the fact that we communicate and we care. And that is not just a feel-good factor. It has an impact on how we work, how we teach. I would dare to say that, which is rare for universities, there's very little competition about where we are in relation to each other. We are a sharing community in terms of materials, rather than saying, oh no, I'm not going to tell you because I want to write about that myself. That's not part of our culture. And it has made an enormous difference, but we also socialize. We've got our own choir, a little choir, of which I am a part. We've got regular events, students and teachers together. I organize an international festival, invite the teachers, and we have a cactus. That's our icon. I thought that's very, cacti, they are resilient. Okay. As my wife and colleagues said this very nicely, this leads, or has over time led to a collective memory. And that is an enormous source of strength and inspiration, that even at the worst of times, we can go back to moments that we need to remember when things get really rough and saying, look, let's go back to what are our strengths and why are we different from others. One more aspect of this, which I would like to highlight here, I don't know what it's like in Austria now. I mean, teacher associations are struggling everywhere for a number of reasons. But there are some that survive. And if they do, like Pestalozzi Friday, I was there last week, they're, again, an enormous source of learning. It's not just inspirational in the sense that you are with like-minded people, but there's something special about teachers learning from each other. I learned an activity that I might try this afternoon, just last week. And the nice thing is, these Pestalozzi Paintek events happen in schools. So we are where we should be when teacher development events are happening, not at some university ground, but in a school with the teachers who have just been teaching. That too kind of sends a signal and makes it special. We're on home ground with these teachers. So, signature strengths, formative experiences, inspirational professional communities so far, as we work our way up the tree. I said at the beginning that I have a problem with sequential when it comes to modeling teacher development. And perhaps it's in part prompted by the fact that I spend so much time with teacher trainees. And so I've been thinking about, 6 years of teaching, 1 year of practice, maybe then 3 years of the reality of school. How much experience does that make? Is that less than 30 years? Or maybe there are things that actually take young teachers, or I should perhaps say teachers at the beginning of their career, into, I think in German you call it Entwicklungssprünge. Yeah, there's a developmental leap that's possible. And I'm sure some of you have had some of those. Now, for the last couple of years, we have organized as a department something called Transformation of Moments conferences for our trainees. And we invite graduates, so these are the early career teachers, to come back. And they talk to us about their teaching. You would perhaps, Chair, call it also a critical incident. But so more than just a critical incident in general, this is about them, where something happened that took them on a leap developmentally. Now, this contrasts a lot with that. I see where Billina's going with this, but I find that rather demotivating as a statement, and I think so would my trainees. So let me share a couple of, just two examples of the sort of transformational moments that some of these young teachers have gone through. And that happens a lot. It does. And Barbara's point here is actually when she, and I think that was a very important moment of rather than feeling angry at the situation, saying, let me think about where I am now, an achievement that I actually have, and what am I already good at? And she was very, very good already at this point. Being a beginner is actually a very good thing. And Huberman and others have shown this clearly. There's a freshness, there's a rawness, there is the willingness to do things differently that I think, let's face it, many of us lose a little bit over time, partly through routine, partly because we just don't have the energy. So there's a lot of positives to being at the beginning of your teaching career and to find out, so why is that a good thing? And focus on that. What was it? I think, Sarah, appreciative inquiry, right? Should focus on that. I mean, to you, experience, this is not a big, but learning about that kind of patience in yourself, as well as being patient with students. Now, that's a value that's very close to a strength of the kind that I talked about earlier, because it permeates everything you do. If you've got that patience in the way that you correct errors, in the way that you set up the class, that'll determine the quality of your teaching no end. So that's a big, big realization, I think. So transformational moments are, I don't think they're necessarily only restricted to young or beginning teachers, but I think they're perhaps underestimated, and we need to find ways of letting particularly those teachers tell their stories, because we don't know about them. And if they are in your school, perhaps, to invite them, even over coffee or tea, to tell you a little bit about something that they've just learned. They'll be happy to tell you, and they're happy to shine a little, which is very important to stay a teacher. I'll come back to that in a moment. I think Tom already mentioned that aspect of teacher development as well. I would add unforeseen to challenges. Many challenges that we face are sort of not exactly predictable, but they don't come out of anywhere. But this one was special. I'm sure that chimes with a lot of us. But I would also say this challenge opened up opportunities for vertical development, I would say. So I'm just taking myself here. You might remember when if and when you were teaching online, you were probably aware and you could read the faces of your students that they were not there with you. Yeah. I think it's, Sarah Mercer, you called it somewhere, willingness to engage. Well, I didn't see much of that. And I had, they were worried about themselves, about their loved ones, about somebody in the hospital, about their futures, where are we going? So I started these classes with a, how are you feeling, in the chat. And then I took a decision on what the numbers were, tried to make it a mix, not to sink into depression, sometimes give some people a chance to talk. Do you want to talk about this? No, fine. Okay. But I had a hunch where, roughly, emotionally, my students were. Thomas Huber called this actually virtual relating. But basically it's relating. And then in Zoom I discovered you could also draw, and I like that. So, I just brought up a cat face and how are you feeling? So instead of an adjective, the student sort of drew a little something into the cat face. Okay. Now the point I'm making is that, for me, I have kept this up even now because I realized this is actually true for any teaching situation. And spending 2, maybe 5 minutes at the beginning of class, face-to-face, taking the temperature of my students is well worth doing. I can cut and paste and change my teaching accordingly, but I have a sense of where they are, whether they're ready to engage with me and with what I have to offer. So for me, that was a big vertical learning step. Now that gets me to my last teacher development aspect. I think I've already said that trees are, well, they can thrive in a certain soil environment, but trees, like people, can also get very ill. And it's interesting, Rangan Chatterjee has this very nice visual looking at how we, not just teachers, move from optimal health to disease. And that's the dangerous thing. Teachers are very bad at reading the signals in themselves because we're always talking about someone else. Well, I've got to do it, it's got to be done, who will take over if I can't afford to, and so on and so forth. And the even more problematic side for me is that this starts now a lot earlier, not just in late career. So I haven't got any research yet, but it seems to me, when we talk amongst colleagues, a lot of our young trainees and the graduates are not well. From sleep disorders to anxiety issues to a host of allergies. And I'm not making a straight line, but it seems very strange to me that when they do talk about their lives, that there shouldn't be a connection. Being a teacher in Hungary is underpaid, undervalued, with a lot of stress. We have a lot of teachers leaving school. This was one of our trainees writing about saying, should I teach? The roller coaster of going through training. So even while they're training, they're beginning to doubt and be worried, because they're also working as they're training. So then when they finish, this continues. Now, many of our schools, this is in Budapest, have a chart. And it says, who will teach tomorrow? Because a corollary of this is that teachers are leaving the profession. Now, I know that's a European problem, but we have our own homemade issues why that is in Hungary. But what you see here is that the age groups, okay, And you can see how the balance is changing. And they're keeping tab of that as a reminder and being particularly caring with the young ones who do stay. Okay. Again, as we heard yesterday, this is a systemic issue too. So, you know, just caring does not necessarily solve the problem. But teacher development, I think, any institution that is serious about it will need to take the well-being of teachers seriously too. So let me finish with a couple of positive sort of do's that I would summarize from my talk. Go back to your roots. Even if you're an experienced teacher with lots of years, it might be really interesting to go back to revisit. How did I start? You know, how have I changed? You know, are some of my qualities actually qualities that I had before I started teaching? Are there some that I've taken on as part of the reflection element of development? Trust that interesting things can happen, particularly when you are younger, in the sense that you don't have to wait, you know, 20 years to have come to a point of feeling I'm now a really good teacher. There are things that might happen, and find ways of, if you have experienced them, of telling others, telling your colleagues. Yeah. To keep the element of freshness that some of our young colleagues have to be saying, okay, even at my point in my development, you know, what is it I can do completely differently now to experiment with? In my case, for example, I wasn't so attracted to it, but I'd like to see what happens with gamification from the point of view of assessment in particular. It seems very attractive. It's not the first thing I would flock to, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. Donald Schoen said, teachers, you know, teachers' rigor is doing something and asking, do I like what I get? Okay? And if you don't like it, you don't continue it. Look for supportive professional development communities. Well, that can mean many things. I mean, if you are in a setting that is not good for you, but you've got to stay, find somewhere else where you can get the nourishment that you need. But it might also mean leave the toxic environment in which you're in. It's all about you at the end of the day. Tell your stories. Well, I think what we're doing now is a very wonderful teacher development opportunity. We are, I think, as speakers, we're just providing prompts to you, and we are genuinely, I think, hoping that you will do the talking and the storytelling as a result of that in breaks, over dinner, and maybe afterwards. And finally, take care of yourself. It's only you. Thank you.